Welcome, class. This week we're going to go over the evolution of the arms trade system. And this is building upon the past few weeks of class. So now that we understand the basics of why a state looks to procure arms and why a state looks to maybe produce arms, now we can really go in and look at the history of the modern arms transfer system. Now, if you remember, when we reviewed Krause's book really gave us a great understanding of the roots of where this arms trade and production system came from. Edward Lawrence's book, which is a book that you're going to be assigned to this week, is really going to dive into what the modern arms transfer system looks like post World War One and really post World War Two. And the really nice thing about this book is it really gives you an idea that if you view the arms trade system at the systemic level, you can see changes. And Lawrence identifies a number of specific arms trade phases that the world goes through. And if we can take a look at the different units of analysis and the way that these arms trade phases are occurring and jumping in between one another, we might be able to infer that maybe we've possibly jumped into a new one in today's world. So let's go ahead and move forward. So the goals of this lecture are really to get you to understand a few important things about the arms trade system itself. First, I want you to understand the evolution of arms trade research since the end of the First World War. And then we're going to dive into Lawrence's book. And in Lawrence's book, I rather need you to understand some important aspects of the arms trade system itself, such as the boundaries and environment, the characteristic of units or primary actors within the system, structure and stratification of the arms trade system at any given point in time, the modes of interaction that are present in some of the primary arms trade system phases, and then the types of regime behavior that's going on within a particular arms trade system phase. And with this, I want you to be able to come out of this lecture and come out of this week with an ability of being able to conceptualize and measure the arms trade system as well. So understanding these key aspects of analysis that Lawrence presents us with, and then also be able to take a look at some of the main sources of scholarship and data and be able to look at today's arms transfer system and begin to really try to understand it and piece part it out. Now, before we go ahead and begin this week and really dive in to the different phases that Lawrence talks to within the book, I think it's really important for us to go over the major sources of arms trade data and their weaknesses, as well as kind of a basic understanding of where some of the arms trade research has kind of gone within the past 60 to 70 odd years. So let's go ahead and dive right into that. Now, how do we measure the arms trade? We've been talking about the arms trade and production system for a while now, for the past three odd lectures. Now, the question that you should ask yourself is really how do we begin to measure it? Because I'm guessing that most of you have at least seen news pieces and things like that just on basic types of arms trade that's going on, whether it's the recent arms trade deal between the states and Europe and the Ukraine to transfer Leopard 2s, or whether it's the U.S. getting a new tranche of F-16s possibly to Turkey. Right, we see arms transfers in the news almost every day, especially if you work in kind of the defense field. It's something that you're going to experience and encounter pretty regularly. But when we start to talk about it in the scholarly or academic sense, we need to have the ability to at least measure arms transfers or have some types of sources where I can take a look at what any given state has transferred within a year. Well, there's good news for that. There are sources out there, but there's not a whole lot of sources. So the traditional sources of arms trade data and arms production data and even military expenditure data come from 3 to 4 primary sources. And the reason why I say 3 to 4 is because it's technically 3, but it's going to look like 4 within the list that you're seeing right now. So the best source that I believe is out there is going to be SIPRI, or the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. Now, SIPRI has a number of different databases that you can look at. They have the Arms Trade Register, which is going to take a look at arms transfers per year. And you can actually separate that out between states, between their exports and their imports. So let's say that I wanted to look at United States exports in a given year, let's say 2005. I can do that. And I can also, with their database, look at the imports that come into the US as well. Now, they do give a breakout as far as what type of military equipment is being transferred, as well as looking at it within the dollar value. And that's going to be important within the next slide. But before we go over there, let's go ahead and look at the rest of the sources of data. So SIPRI also puts out, which is really interesting from a U.S. defense perspective, every year the top companies within the world that are producing arms, and that's going to be on the dollar value of deals. And that's really interesting because you can really see not only what companies are exporting the most arms in any given year, but it's also the associated state. So we can also take a look at where a lot of these military industries tend to be concentrated, which is really interesting from an academic point of view. Now, you also have what's called the ACDA, which turned into the World Munitions, I forget, well, it's on the screen there. The ACDA turned into the WMEAT, and essentially what that was the U.S. government's kind of version of SIPRI, where each year they looked at the arms exports in any given year and pushed that out in a published PDF, which wasn't necessarily as easy to read as a lot of the SIPRI stuff. But the really interesting thing about the ACDA and having the WMEAT out there is you could compare that to the SIPRI, and they usually kind of rode with each other. And the data was pretty similar between the two. Not to say that there weren't discrepancies. Obviously, there were. Because there's also going to be an issue with trying to report and get arms transfer data. And lastly, and relatively new as far as being an easily accessible database, is going to be the UN Arms Trade Register, which does essentially the same thing as the WMEAT and SIPRI. They're going to look at each year, and those are voluntary numbers given to the UN. This is one thing that you have to keep in mind with any arms database that you're going to look at, whether it's going to be SIPRI, whether it's going to be the UN Arms Trade Register, whether it's going to be the WMEAT. All these are voluntary numbers. So states don't necessarily, they aren't required to report every year. So that's something to keep in mind. And that really comes down to developing states are usually less likely to report. Other states have other reasons not to report as well, but we'll kind of go over that in the next slide. Another thing to keep in mind is the WMEAT, unfortunately, and much to my chagrin, stopped publishing in 2021. So they have really good data up to 2021. Unfortunately, I guess the U.S. government didn't necessarily see it valuable to keep that rolling, so they went ahead and canceled it. But we still have SIPRI, which is alive and well. And really, to me, if you have to go anywhere to get your data, that's going to be it. Not only because the data seem to be accurate, it's also the most easy to use and easily accessible out there too. Well, even though there's 3 sources, let's go ahead and go over some of the weaknesses that are going to be within the data. Now, we have to keep in mind, because the arms trade is something that states don't necessarily want everybody to have a perfect vision into, there's going to be weaknesses within the data that you're going to be able to pull. SIPRI, as far as validity goes, SIPRI has acknowledged that much of their information prior to 1970 is fairly weak. That's because, again, prior to 1970, we're in the height of the Cold War, and both of the major arms exporters, both the US and the Soviet Union, had an incentive to misreport the numbers. And that still goes on today. Remember that none of these sources of data are required for states to report. So states are only going to report usually what they perceive as what's innocuous, right? What's not going to really bother anybody to find out that they've transferred. So states don't necessarily want to report everything in the way that they may be transferring arms to a recipient, which may not be popular or may not look good. But states also have an incentive to misreport because they're providing a military capability to an ally that they may not want everybody to know, right? So states have an incentive to misreport. Now, the one really nice thing about SIPRI, and I hate to see, well, I don't hate to do it, but if it seems like I'm biased towards SIPRI, that's because I am, because they've run a number of models against their data with error code or with margins for error, and statistically they seem to be on the right track. So even though it's not going to give you the perfect number, it's not going to be 100% accurate, they're at least in the ballpark. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we're looking at all these information sources on the arms trade, they all tend to move with each other, which tells us that although the numbers may be off a tad bit, at least we can infer some major cycles within the arms trade where at a certain decade arms transfers go down or up. We can still see those, even with somewhat messy data. Now, when we're looking at measurement too, we also have to keep in mind that the way that you measure the arms trade is going to change the way in which the arms trade looks. Now, value is not always a good measure. So databases that only look at the value of arms tend not to give the whole story. Think about that, right? Like, it makes sense. $100,000 worth of guns is a lot different than $100,000 worth of aircraft, right? So transferring that capability, $100,000 worth of guns, is probably going to make a bigger difference, especially in these intrastate conflicts, than $100,000 worth of aircraft. So those tend to, they're categorically different. We have to be able to understand that. Even if we look at the quantity, though, we suffer the same problem as just looking at value. If we're looking at 100,000 guns, it's going to look a lot different than 100,000 aircraft, right? That means a lot. That means a much different thing for a recipient state. So again, going back to SIPRI, the one really nice thing about SIPRI, what they provide you is not only can they provide you data output for the value of arms being transferred, but you can even look at the types of arms being transferred as well, as far as the quantity and the type. So that's a really nice thing to look at. We also have to keep in mind that defense services and licensed production is not typically measured. So if we're looking at licensed production, let's say that Russia, again, has given licensed production of the Su-30 within India. Those numbers of Su-30s aren't going to be counted under many of the data sources. It's not going to count if they push off 10 Su-30s from the production line off of a licensed production. You aren't going to see that within the data. So do keep that in mind. And especially since the world is really moving towards more of this offset-driven licensed production, that type of production and that type of data really isn't being captured in a lot of these databases. So do keep that in mind. And then lastly, of course, and this is sort of related to the prior bullet point, offsets are not accounted for either. If you don't know what offsets are, if you go to my YouTube page, I actually have a video that goes over the basics of offsets. Essentially what an offset is, for those of you who don't know, is a recipient state may decide to purchase 10 planes from the US, but they have a 50% offset requirement. What that essentially means is that 50% of the value of that deal has to be spent within their own country. And this is kind of most states throughout the world now require some sort of offset, which is really upsetting to U.S. defense industry because technically the U.S. government doesn't really like it. But it's becoming more and more prevalent, also because arms are becoming more and more expensive, right? So trying to outright buy a F-35 for most states is just going to be prohibitively expensive. So you want to incur some type of offset there. So the offset not only allows the country, the recipient state, to be able to recoup some of that contract money, but it also allows for some sort of knowledge transfer to occur too, because let's say that half of that money has to be spent in a direct offset, which means it has to be directly related to the deal. So if I'm buying F-35s, an offset may be that, you have to figure out a way to make half of this contract value produced in my own state. So let's say that you now let me produce the wings, and then I get a certain percentage off of the plane because I produce the wings myself. Right. So offsets can also deal in indirect or direct. And again, if you go to my YouTube page and you take a look at the offset video that's going to be able to explain kind of just the basics of what offsets actually are. And the important thing to keep in mind again is these types of unique deals aren't necessarily going to be captured by the databases that are out there. So just keep that in mind. Now, before we really dive into Lawrence's phases of the arms trade system, I think it's important for us to at least have a basic understanding of where the arms trade scholarship has been and where it's kind of going to. So, one thing that you need to keep in mind, especially when we're looking at the arms trade scholarship, and something that you guys may have noticed too, pulling some of the PDFs from the previous lectures, is that much of the arms trade scholarship, at least that I'm providing you, seems to be written in the 70s and the 80s. And there's a good reason for that, because that's when it really kind of popped off. It's really coming back now within the past 2 to 3 years, which has been really interesting. I think the arms transfer dynamic that's going on with the Ukraine war, I think, is going to spur another kind of renaissance of arms trade scholarship. But most of your quantitative arms trade scholarship is going to be kind of from the past, from the 70s and the 80s, and then even into the early 90s. But really, during the late 90s into the early 2000s, there's kind of like this black hole of arms trade scholarship. It really wasn't there. So from a macro point of view, much of the arms trade scholarship literature tends to mirror the problems or the concerns of the era. So based on the time that these pieces were written. So they usually tend to be either pro or anti-arms trade. They seem to have some type of just... Rarely do you read something, unless you're going to arms trade economics, more of the Bitzinger type of books that we've read in this class. Those are very neutral. Once you get into more of an international relations or policy oriented scholarship set, they tend to either skew either pro or anti-arms trade. So just keep that in mind. The quantitative scholarship is relatively new. Really, the 80s was the first time that you really see that popping off for the arms trade literature. Now it's pretty rare, at least in the academic sense, when you're looking at international relations journal pieces on the arms trade. It's very rare for you to get a qualitative piece. It's almost always quantitative, which is good in one way and bad in the other. It's good in one way in the sense that you can actually have a measurable value. It's also bad in another way, in which you really don't get an analysis of the qualitative nature of some of these transfers. So, there's tends to be a pro and a con with it. The arms trade scholarship also tends to roll in distinct phases. You get a first distinct phase post World War I. Then, when you have declining bipolar rivalry in the late 70s to the early 80s, you have another resurgence during the post-Gulf War era. And then lastly, you have another phase which coincides with the increased intrastate conflict when we get into the late 90s and into the early 2000s with the War on Terror. So let's go ahead and break some of those phases out. All right, so the first main phase of arms trade scholarship that you're really going to find is going to come from the post-World War I era. That's where you have books like War is a Racket by Smedley Butler, which is still a great read today. I don't necessarily, it's not entirely true where he puts the blame, but it is a really interesting book to kind of get the feeling of the fervor that kind of revolved around the arms trade post-World War I. These books primarily had a negative view of the arms trade. War is a Racket is one of the most famous ones, which did have a very negative view. Essentially, War is a Racket and a lot of the other pieces of literature that are going to come out during this period blame a lot of these private arms manufacturers and states in which these manufacturers reside in trying to profit from war. So it's really a scathing critique. And what's really interesting about it is in the wake of a lot of this critique, you see a lot of nationalization or national control over arms transfers post World War I in response to this. So you see a lot more export controls pop up in Britain and the US. Private arms manufacturers like Krupp, private arms manufacturers like Armstrong and Vickers in Britain aren't able to freely transfer their arms like they were pre-World War I. Also, keep in mind that much of this scholarship is going to be qualitative. That just means that they don't necessarily have perfect numbers. They don't review the numbers like a statistician does. These are going to be qualitative pieces that are going to look at policy and make some type of assertion from the understanding of the policy at the time. Now, that went on for a long time. Then we get into more of a declining bipolar politic era. Again, still, it's a negative view of arms transfers, and it primarily focuses on developing nations. So, if you really look at the late 70s into the 80s, many developing nations are having civil conflicts or having small little proxy conflicts throughout the world. And the US and Russia really fueling these conflicts by providing arms to both sides. So much of your scholarship kind of takes the view of the US and Russia are essentially making these developing countries bleed to make their own points. All right, so it's going to have a negative view of arms trade. We really kind of start to get into more of this quantitative analysis, especially when you get into like Katz's books on arms production in developing nations and things like that. You're seeing this rise of scholars being able to use quantitative sources of data to kind of defend their point more. However, it's still very qualitative in nature. It still really looks at the policy and whether we should be doing it or not. But you also have the rise of international relations scholarship at this point in time, too, really past the late 1950s. And it comes into its own in the 70s and the 80s using this large and quantitative research, which really comes into its own in the next period in the 90s and the 2000s. So you move from the declining bipolar politics era, you move into the post-Gulf War era. This is kind of the next phase of arms trade scholarship. Again, here we have a negative view of arms. Remember that post-Gulf War also coincides with the end of the Cold War, so you have this massive drop in military expenditure around the globe. We also have to keep in mind that we face the the United States faced the Iraqi army in the Gulf War, and the Iraqi army was primarily built up from a number of different sources of arms transfers that come out of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And much of the literature pointed towards this laissez-faire attitude of arms trade in the 80s, kind of being responsible for this massive buildup within both Iran and Iraq of military capability, which allows states to now be able to exert force on other states. In this case, it was Iraq exerting force on Kuwait. So much of the scholarship looked at just this laissez-faire, just free-for-all of arms transfers during this era and had a very negative view of it. This is where you start to see a lot of these, and I can really only speak to U.S. export controls. This is where you really see the rise in U.S. export controls as far as a more comprehensive international trade and arms regulations. This is where you see a lot of export controls come into play. The one really nice thing about it from an IR perspective is this is also where you see the rise of a lot of quantitative analysis as far as arms transfer go in international relations scholarship, which is really interesting to read. And we start to see patterns at this point in time. So we're looking at arms trade and realizing during the 80s, we had a lot of arms trade. What caused it? What did it cause from that? So a lot of your quantitative international relations arms trade scholarship really was birthed out of this era. And then lastly, we have the War on Terror era, which is going to primarily focus on arms transfers to non-state actors. This is where we have the rise of a lot of intrastate conflicts. Or civil conflicts within states. And we look at more of this illicit arms transfer activity, which is going on in a lot of developing nations. If you see movies like Lord of War, it kind of goes into it. So this really big focus on illicit arms transfers throughout the world, especially fueling a lot of these civil conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. So again, it primarily focuses on intrastate conflict, and it's largely quantitative again. And you really aren't, you probably aren't going to see a move towards qualitative scholarship, especially in the US, for this foreseeable future, just because international relations has really morphed into more of a quantitative, large N based um, type of scholarship. So your qualitative is primarily going to be saved for your more kind of newsy pieces like articles from foreign policy or foreign affairs, and your scholarship, as far as what's coming out at the collegiate level in academic journals and things like that, is going to remain largely quantitative.